Tatarin followed the tattered patchwork cloak of the Herald ahead of him as he moved through the lowly tent city. The stench of rot and feces was overpowering. The small settlement was far outside Eldaruun's wall, on the edge of the forest that surrounded it on two sides. It was a basin that collected all of those who were cast out of Brokken's so-called glorious order. He had passed through the decrepit town, if it could even be called that, on his way into the city weeks before. The Bloodbrood could often find allies in places like this, or sacrifices, if not. They approached a rickety butcher's stand with a spread of rotten meat in various shades of green and gray. A swarm of flies buzzed heavy overhead, nearly covering the grotesque sight. Tatarin was accustomed to death, but he preferred fresher kills. The fetid display caused even his stomach to turn. Despite the unsightly appearance of the decomposing meat, the cuts were of unmistakably high quality. The work of a true butcher. A scrawny man appeared from behind a blood-stained curtain, wiping his hands on a once white apron that was already dyed nearly black from his gruesome art. The man stood a head taller than Tatarin, who was by no means small, and his pale, almost translucent skin was stretched tight by jagged, protruding bones. The hair that remained on his head was white and thin. Tatarin had met this creature of a man once before, when he had helped smuggle him among the waitstaff into a private party of wicked nobility. The ghoulish man noticed the herald, before sighing and putting the knuckles of his fore and middle fingers flat against his throat, a sign of respect to those of the blood. The herald bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement. The scrawny creature's face turned to Tatarin, where an ugly sneer replaced passive indifference.
You survived?
I'm hard to kill.
The man chuckled wryly.
Flesh is flesh, boy. It all carves, it all bleeds, it all dies.
The herald stepped forward and cleared his throat.
We seek passage through the forest and supplies for the journey.
The Lord of Blood will have his due.
He motioned for them to enter his shack behind the butchery stall. The herald followed, and so did Tatarin after mustering up the stomach. The man outfitted them with food, clothes, and tents, enough to hopefully make it through the forest in one piece. Tatarin didn't know how much of a head start he had on the mad detective and his creature. He just hoped it was enough. The butcher also had a disturbing stock of victims in a pen behind his shack. Horrid creatures, bruised, bloodied, and broken. People without hope, who the butcher had preyed upon. A broken soul was never as useful as a full one, but blood was blood, and Tatarin was given his fill. Outstretched hands brushed against the herald's cloak and Tatarin's clothes as they walked to the edge of the village. The hands of the lowly, the outcast, the forgotten. Very few of them worshipped Crom, but all praised his herald as he passed them by. He had that effect on people. They praised Tatarin too by association. One man, presumably of the brood, even held a knife to his wrist as they walked by, offering his blood and soul to the two of them. The herald stopped and placed a hand on the man's withered shoulder.
The Lord is grateful for your sacrifice. Save your strength. He may yet have need of it.
The man wept in joy at this prophecy and collapsed to the floor, proclaiming the greatness of Crom. Tatarin once would have exulted in his zealotry. Now it made him sick. There were well-worn roads through the forest, as crossing through it was the only way to the great city of Vastrin, but the deepening shadows of the waning light overhead made the path less clear. He was not afraid. There were very few things outside fey-cursed sanguines and gods that could stand against the full might of a fourth aspect Hemomancer and Crom's own herald. Still, there were a great many things about the world that he still did not know, and a great many horrors of the old worlds that still lingered in dark corners and forgotten forests. Claps of thunder called out their foreboding song in chorus with the creaking branches and whipping leaves. A storm was coming. The wind that grew increasingly more violent helped bridge the gaps of long silence between Tatarin and the herald. Hours passed, and the sun was consumed by dark clouds, swaying trees, and the fog-covered horizon. The dark sky finally began to open and let loose its torrents, and so the heralds stopped in a clearing to begin erecting their shelter.
We will press on once the storm passes,
The herald said, once the small tent was finally in place. They ate scraps of dried meat given to them by the butcher, thankfully less rotten than what he had on display, and then attempted to sleep. Tatarin could not find the world of dreams tonight, however. His mind was racing, full of fears, regrets, and possibilities. He had run for so long, fighting against his appointment, his fate, only to be roped back into it. He wanted to be free from Crom, free from Brokken, free to be his own person and forge his own path. But he knew that that was impossible now. This was his life, and there was only one way out of it. The sounds of rain, wind, and thunder helped to drown out his thoughts, but it didn't help sleep to come. He didn't know how much time had passed before he heard sounds outside. Barely audible compared to the chaos around them, but he had listened to that chaos for hours now. He knew this was something different. He sat up, brushing his short brown hair against the slanted canopy of the tent. He breathed deeply and reached within himself, pulling on rivers of blood and threads of souls. Martonus and his Faeden pet had forced nearly every ounce of usable soul out of him during their tortures. Connections and reserves he had been building for years upon years. A few threads still remained, but hardly strong enough to pull from. After regaining his strength with the aid of the butcher's poor pets, he had only his own soul to draw from now. But that soul was full and strong once again. He felt the blood within him ebb and flow, shifting, changing. He pushed it towards his head, his senses, and then expanded outwards. He closed his eyes in the darkness, and his hearing doubled, then tripled. The hairs on his skin stood on end as he felt every hint of motion, every gust of wind push past the tent. He smelled rain and mud and trees. He smelled the electric energy from the lightning and He smelled something else. Something aged and rotting. Something foul. He quested further with his senses, searching for the source. It was close. It was very close. A terrible scream reverberated through Tatarin's heightened senses, forcing him to cover his ears and cry out in pain. Moments later, claws longer than his hands tore through the canvas tent, shredding it to pieces, and a massive form struck him, casting Tatarin and the herald into the rain. The herald thrashed around as he tumbled out of his bedroll. He reached for his staff and propped himself up, fighting to his feet. Tatarin retracted his soul, trying to take in his surroundings with his naked eyes and senses. He crouched in the cold rain, surrounded by the remnants of their shelter, puddles pooling at his feet. Blood dripped down his arm from a stray claw. Good. Now he wouldn't have to cut himself. His eyes tracked through the foggy darkness, searching for movement. The herald drew out a thin, curved knife from under his cloak and slowly turned in the night.
Reach out, child! What do you feel?
He said in a hurried whisper. Tatarin did reach out, grasping for blood, for souls. He could sense hints of his own blood on the creature's claws, but other than that, he felt nothing. Or at least, next to nothing. There were faint traces, memories of souls crushed and blood spilled by this creature. What was this monstrosity that not even his powers could... His blood chilled.
It's a Sangul!
He shouted, locking onto the direction the beast was in. Now that he knew what to look for, he could trace the faint lingering shadows of the souls the beast had consumed to create a mental outline of the creature.
How?
The herald stammered, turning to face the same direction.
It's impossible. A fallen would never strike against me.
The herald held up his hand, and blood seeped from his very skin, then ignited in a ball of crimson fire. It rose into the air and cast the area in a bloodied glow. The shadow of the beast crept towards the dome of light, its monstrous form seeming to materialize as the light shone upon it. First, its head, hairless and mottled, ridges of bone protruding in unnatural directions. Its eyes were wide and slitted, though graying, as if blind. More bony protrusions covered in flesh stuck up from the sides of the creature's head in mockery of ears. Its mouth, however, sent shivers of fear into Tatarin's core. Rows upon rows of razor-sharp teeth for shredding flesh and soul alike. But all of them paled next to the two cruel fangs that curved down past the monster's sunken chin. Its 5 claws from each hand drug on the ground, carving grooves into the mud. Its legs, which were bent and broken to face the wrong way, dragged slowly forward towards them, hauling the rest of the emaciated creature into the red glow. 2 vestigial wings sprouted from its back, thrashing, nothing more than bone and torn flesh, a poor imitation of their dark master. It was hard to believe that this creature was once human, even sanguine. The fate of the fallen was one that Tatarin did not envy.
Stay your claws, spawn of blood,
the herald shouted to the Sangul. It continued pushing closer at a slow pace that made his skin crawl. Tatarin knew these creatures were faster than any natural beast, yet it seemed to be toying with them.
In the name of Crom, and by my authority as his herald, I command you to cease!
It stopped in its muddy tracks, rain washing over its grotesque form. Then, with a blood-curdling scream, it lunged for the kill. The beast struck with impossible speed, a streak of death in the crimson rain. Tatarin dove out of the way as fetid claws sliced raindrops inches from his head. The herald staggered back, shocked at the creature ignoring his commands, but readying himself quickly with his dagger. Blood seeped from Tatarin's wound, trailing down his arm and coalescing into a short sword of razor-sharp blood. Casting spells or maintaining armor was very taxing and drew a lot of blood, but a sword he could do. He prayed to a god he hated that it would be enough. The creature reared with a pained scream and dove towards the herald, who proved to be surprisingly spry for his apparent old age. He deftly sidestepped the raging beast and carved an arc with his blade that trailed a razor of blood which sliced into the Sangul's side. It recoiled in pain and rage before lashing out again, this time at Tatarin. The Sangul lunged with razor-tipped claws outstretched, waiting to catch his dodge. Tatarin hesitated for a split second, allowing the beast in close enough before stepping towards the creature that had left itself wide open. Tatarin's blade found the Sangul's small and withered heart as it plunged through its rotting flesh. Claws raked at his back as it convulsed and screamed, tearing away cloth and flesh alike. Tatarin endured the pain. He was used to pain. Tatarin stared into the creature's cold, bloodless eyes as any semblance of life faded with echoes of screams and blood. A moment later, the herald was at his side, helping him stand and passing his hands over the various wounds the creature had inflicted on his back. Sanguines and Hemomancers often overlooked the healing capabilities of their powers. Tatarin and the herald met each other's eyes in open weariness and concern. Something like this should never have happened. Rain soaked Tatarin to his bones as they walked through the dark forest. Their small shelter was nothing but tattered canvas and broken sticks now, and would offer them no more protection. So they journeyed through the night, illuminated by the bloody red glow of the herald's light.
Why?
Tatarin asked, his words barely breaking through the repetition of rain, wind, and thunder.
Why what, child?
Why has Crom decided to spare my life for now, only to send a Sangul to kill us?
I do not believe the Sangul was Crom's doing. As for the other...
Thunder and rain once again filled out the silence, and Tatarin feared the herald would not speak further.
That is much more complicated to answer.
You're his herald. Surely you know his intentions.
His intentions I do know. His motives, however, are often his and his alone. He is weakened currently. He has been for a long time. Brokken's apotheosis affected him greatly. Brokken had sworn Crom as his enemy since the inception of his empire. Brokken's order against Crom's chaos. While Brokken was mortal, Crom always had the upper hand. Now,
The herald stopped walking under a large evergreen tree, briefly shielding them from the torrential downpour.
There was a byproduct of Brokken's Apotheosis. A creature of war and destruction, in many ways like the steel monstrosities you fought under the control of the paladins and their wardens. It hunts for him.
And he wishes for me to destroy it.
I wish for you to rebuild the brood that once was. But first you must go to him. Offer your strength. Not as a sacrifice yet, but as an ally. And a humble servant. And as a symbol of strength against our enemies. This threat is severe. Crom needs our strength now more than ever.
Is that all I'm good for? Killing. Being an example of death and destruction to rally the troops?
What is blood?
What?
What is blood?
It's the soul. A source of divine power.
It's more than power, Tatarin. It's a gateway into the other world itself that allows its energies to flow into the mortal world. Yes, the soul has a power in and of itself. That power holds the person's memories and personality, their willpower and inner strength. When you burn a soul, you are not destroying the power, nor are you destroying the person. You are simply pulling more energy through than it can handle, and so it collapses. But the energy of that person becomes a part of you. The way of blood is not one of destruction and death, but of transfiguration and change.
I seem to leave a lot of destruction and death wherever I go, regardless.
Tatarin felt the herald's sad and disappointed gaze as he walked forward, deeper into the stormy night. The sun had just crested over the distant city of Vastrin when they exited the dense forest. Sparse trees still littered the landscape along the wide river leading up to the vast lake which the city sat on the bank of. The lake was nearly a sea, and the city had spread its tendrils almost its entire width. It was quite a sight to behold. It was one of Apis' longest-standing cities and kingdoms, and the first that Brokken had conquered during his first unification war. Many histories claimed Brokken was a king without a kingdom, as he was never officially crowned until he pronounced himself emperor. But after he seized Vastrin, through guile and the strength of the army he had built, it became his seat. Not only was it a powerful city and kingdom in its own right, but it was nearly impenetrable to enemy attack and was the perfect position to strike out against the other kingdoms, such as the one that once sat where Eldaruun now stood. Tatarin hated Brokken, but he did respect his efficiency and effectiveness as a commander and conqueror. Of course, he was also a tyrant and a brute, and the sworn enemy of Crom and his followers. The widespread genocide of Tatarin's people was one of Brokken's first crusades. Thankfully, it was a mission he never saw to completion, but it was still a theme that carried all these centuries later. They arrived at the small port town on the near side of the lake, and the herald paid a ferryman in Brokken marks for a trip across to the city. Travel around the lake would take hours, if not days, depending on conditions. Crossing was clearly the easiest path, as evidenced by the large line of people waiting to board the approaching vessel. It was a tight-packed boat, but the sea was relatively calm as they crossed the expanse. The ferry was powered by a strange mix of magical artificery and steam, complex devices that Tatarin had only heard of and which produced terrible black clouds and deafening sound. The sea may have been still, but the smell of the crude engine turned Tatarin's stomach. A little more than an hour passed before they approached the large sea walls that had been built out from the water itself. Two gargantuan round gates rotated out from the water in front of them, like massive metal grated fans unfurling to reveal the city beyond. Guards eyed the boat from their towers on either side of the impressive gate. As they passed through the arches, the true scale of the city became apparent. It sprawled upward in tiers, leading to the penultimate palace that sat below an imposing statue of Brokken. Within the walled bay, there were hundreds of fishing boats and leisure ferries. There were also numerous rafts built off from the docks, as if the city itself was spilling over into the sea. The sight was impressive, though not nearly as colossal as Eldaruun itself, a fact that the residents of Vastrin harbored a grudge about. It was still breathtaking. They docked at the large central harbor that was bustling with vitality. Carts full of wares were pulled back and forth, loading and unloading hundreds of riverboats.
Where exactly are we going?
Tatarin asked, while they pushed through the crowd exiting the ferry.
Up.
The herald responded. They pressed on towards the rising city. Tatarin's senses were assaulted by the overwhelming colors of fabrics and spices, the deafening sound of shouts and magical and industrial devices, the malodorous smell of so many things that Tatarin could not place. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply, tuning his sense to ignore the stench. Behind the overpowering smell of the overpopulated city was the fresh air of the sea behind him and the mountains ahead. His blood shifted and his soul expanded, connecting ever so gently to the souls around him. The sound his ears heard dulled to a low whine, and he felt nothing but the warm breeze. Despite his suppressed senses, he moved expertly through the crowd, resonating with the blood of each person he passed. He smiled gently to himself. Each person, each soul was so vibrant and colorful and varied. Alive. He opened his eyes to the chaos, threatening to overwhelm him again. After 3 weeks, which felt like 3 eternities, stuck in that stone box, this was all a lot to take in. He could do it, though. He just needed to focus. He closed his eyes again and saw him. 2 eyes of burning red hatred drank in the dark world around him. He stopped in place. The dull whine in his ears turned into terrified screams of death, screams he had caused. He tried to scream too, but nothing came out. He opened his eyes, but nothing changed. The world beyond his eyelids looked the same as the one behind. His body shook, his mind quaked. Sheer panic threatened to crush him under the gaze of those terrible, awesome eyes. Within them, he saw every drop of blood he had ever spilled, every soul he had ever claimed, every life he had ever extinguished, being burned away in a furnace hotter than the sun. Those all-consuming blazes seemed to taunt him. Behind the hatred was an edge of mirth that made him want to vomit, but no vomit came. He tried to scream again, his will pressing violently against the confines of his mind and body. Then, before he knew what happened, his body hit the warm cobblestones underfoot. Tatarin's mind awoke before his body. Those blinding red fires still burned overhead. He was indoors now, as evidenced by the lack of wind and the reverberating noises that felt so distant to him. Despite there being a roof above him, those eyes felt no less near, no less intense. He forced his soul to expand. The blood rushed to every part of his still unconscious body, injecting adrenaline and life into every muscle and fiber of his being. He shot awake with a start, nearly launching himself off of the plush 4-poster bed where he laid. The bed was lavishly dressed with deep red silk, and the mattress and pillows felt as if they could swallow him whole. A thin sheet lay draped loosely across his body, which he now noticed was fully unclothed.
"Ah, I see our guest has awoken,"
a feminine voice said from another room, her smooth, sultry words barely audible to him.
I must excuse myself and see to the boy.
"Nonsense, Harold. He is a guest in my house. I will take care of him,"
she said.
Of course, my lady,
the herald replied with respect. The woman's voice had a hint of nobility to it, the way she drew out the vowels and clipped the consonants. He had learned to pick noble voices out of a crowd, if for no other reason than to avoid them. He pulled the thin sheet up around his body as footsteps drew near to the ornately furnished room. The door opened, and Tatarin's breath and blood caught. A beautiful woman, hardly a few years Tatarin's senior, stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. She had deep black and straight hair that fell down near her waist. Her face had just the right amount of roundness in the cheeks, just the right amount of sharpness in the jaw, and just the right amount of plumpness to the lips to easily make her the most beautiful creature he had ever laid eyes on. Her long features drew his eyes down the plunging neckline of her silk dress. Her ample bosom was on clear display under the scandalous fabric that draped her wide hips and down to the floor. A scent of roses and iron wafted through the air. His heart was pounding, his blood rushing. He had never really chased women before. They had often thrown themselves at him. As a third aspect Hemomancer in the Brood, he had his pick of women, and they considered it an honor to gain his attention. In that moment, however, he would have offered up all the attention he ever had just to kiss those lush pink lips once. She glided towards him, a predatory smile on her face. He felt himself leaning forward, drawn to her. His heart quickened, his blood raced, his blood was his own. He controlled it. What was happening to him? Who was this woman? The impossibly beautiful woman parted her lips slightly, running her tongue over her perfectly white teeth, and the two venomous fangs that protruded from the top in front of the rest. He blinked and shook himself. He regained control over his heart and his blood, forcing it to submit to him and him alone. This was no mere woman. She was a sanguine. A devious twinkle in the woman's eye faded as she realized her enchantment had failed. The woman standing in front of Tatarin now was still beautiful, but in the same way a slender viper was beautiful, right up until it went for your throat.
And here I thought I was going to be able to have a little fun with you,
she said, clicking her tongue.
What a shame.
She slid down, sitting on the bed, her back, which was exposed down to her waist, facing towards him. She turned her head to face him, looking over her raised shoulder. Enchantment or not, being this close to her, her scent filling his lungs, it was intoxicating.
You're sanguine,
he stuttered. She splayed her thin fingers against her wide, nearly bare chest.
My, whatever gave it away? It was the fangs, wasn't it? Or perhaps the wings?
She said ruefully. Two spines of bone sprouted from her back, spraying blood on Tatarin's face. Flesh grew up the vestigial appendages as they continued to reach outwards, spreading 5 feet in either direction. The wings were unlike any creature he had ever seen, and in reality, he wasn't sure if they could even be called wings. They had no feathers like that of a bird, nor webbing like a bat. They looked like they belonged to a bird that had been plucked and feathered and prepared for the roast, only much longer and more articulated. Blood of Crom. She wasn't merely sanguine. She was a sanguine lord. Or lady, he supposed. Wings like these on a sanguine either noted them as transcending the first blood, or falling to become a sangul. And after encountering one of those in the forest the previous night, he could definitively say she was not one of those. His brain struggled to recall the names of the sanguine lords from memory. Legend claimed that there were only 5 currently, only one of which was a woman.
Lady Lacine,
he said, wiping the blood from his face, not daring to try and draw upon it. Such an act would be as painful for him as attempting to draw the blood from that fake-cursed detective. Cursed blood could not be touched by his magic. Not without substantial damage to his own soul, that is. She winked, a yellowish-green eye at him. At first glance, a sanguine's eye would appear normal, if oddly colored. It wouldn't be until further inspection that one would notice their small pupils were narrow, serpentine slits. She turned around. Her arms that supported her on the bed were pressing against her breasts, which seemed as if they would tear out from the thin fabric holding them apart at any moment. She hoisted herself fully onto the bed and crawled towards him on all 4s, one leg appearing from a slit in the long dress. He scooted back until he bumped up against the headboard, his hands clenched tight around the blanket that covered his naked body. She continued forward, like a snake hunting a mouse. The sharp ends of her sleek vestigial wings brushed against the posts of the bed and its canopy. She stopped just inches from his face, her gorgeous body straddling his.
What's wrong, pet? You don't want to play with your betters?
She pouted her lips, and her eyes went dewy with mock innocence. Every hair on his body stood on end. Yes, she was unnaturally attractive, but something about her eyes, or rather, the eyes behind her eyes, disturbed him. Not to mention she was the closest thing the Sanguines had to royalty. The Bloodbrood and the Sanguines often kept their distance. Despite them serving the same god, they generally kept to themselves, though he supposed the Herald was an exception, as he was himself a Sanguine of sorts. Regardless, Tatarin knew better than to get involved in Sanguine politics any more than he already was by just being here.
I would like to get dressed now,
He stammered.
By all means, please do.
She said. The corners of her mouth turned up, and she motioned with her eyes towards a stack of fresh new clothes that sat on an upholstered bench under the window to his right. He wriggled himself out from under her in a rather awkward fashion, trying his best to avoid touching her, though that proved to be a fool's errand. He noticed her wings retracting, fading away into her smooth back. He stood up from the bed. He still clutched the silk sheet around himself. She turned around once her wings fully receded and laid back on the bed, leaning to one side so she could watch him. Despite his natural instincts to cover himself, he had hardly ever been shy or ashamed, and he refused to let this seductress put him any more on edge. He let the sheet fall to the floor, and pointedly ignored her smiles as he dressed. The clothes were finer than any he had ever worn or owned. Exceptionally soft silks and linens. It was a plain white shirt with a high collar and straight black pants. He finished dressing, donning the shiny black leather boots that sat on the floor. Then, without another glance towards her, he exited the room. He heard her chuckle as he entered the hallway. A small sitting room sat just to the side, and he could sense the herald there. He approached, and a friendly smile welcomed him. He sat down next to the older man, and Lady Lacine exited the room and followed. The beautiful young and impish girl that had been teasing him mere minutes before now had the bearing of a consummate queen. Of course, what he had interpreted as youth was a mere illusion. Well, perhaps not an illusion, but it certainly was not indicative of true age. For a Sanguine to become a Sanguine lord, they must be of the first blood, having been given the gift by Crom himself, something he had not done in centuries, if not millennia. Not to mention that they would also need to reach the precipice, as Sanguines called it, which for a first blood could take 1,000 years in itself. This woman was ancient. Sanguines did not suffer from the madness in the same way as mortals, though a much worse fate would await them once their gift ran its course. The only way to avoid that fate was by becoming a lord, which, as mentioned before, was only possible for the very few first blood, and even that wasn't a guarantee. They still lived extremely long lives, the length mostly dependent on who they were gifted by. How they were able to avoid the traditional madness was a matter of much debate within circles that Tatarin generally tried his best to avoid. Tatarin would happily take the madness over the terrible descent into a monster that awaited a Sanguine after passing over their precipice. Lacine took a seat across from Tatarin, stoic resolve on her face. She picked up a glass of crimson wine that sat nearby and raised it to her lush lips.
How are you feeling, child?
The herald asked him.
Well, I think the Keeper and his beast are tracking me. I don't know how, but when I close my eyes, I see his.
The herald thought on this for a moment before speaking.
Perhaps your mind and soul are simply taxed from all that has...
I know what I saw.
Tatarin blurted. Those terrible red eyes were still burned into his mind. A chill ran down his entire body, and the hair on the back of his neck stiffened.
I can feel him, watching me, hunting me.
Then we will deal with him when he comes. Speaking of being hunted,
the herald said, turning his attention to Lacine.
Have you ever had a Sangul disobey direct commands?
Lacine lowered her glass and weighed the herald in her unnerving eyes.
You know Sanguls. They can be difficult at times.
But have they ever ignored a direct command?
He pushed.
No, not unless they were under command from another lord. Why?
One of the damn beasts attacked us in the forest.
Tatarin cut in. She looked surprised.
A Sangul attacked the Herald of Crom? Ridiculous!
She laughed. The herald met her eyes without a hint of mirth.
Oh dear, you're quite serious, aren't you? That is troublesome.
She returned the glass to her lips, looking at them from under her dark brow, and not saying another word on the subject.
On to other matters, I suppose,
The herald said. Tatarin assumed the herald was as suspicious as he was about how quickly she ignored that topic, though they would be fools to make even the hint of an accusation while in the lady's house.
Do hurry up. I must meet with the city council soon. Dreadful work. But keeping the city functional is imperative to my plans.
You're on the city council?
He asked. She barked a laugh.
Child, I own the city council. I am the Queen of Astron.
Tatarin didn't know how to respond to such a claim. How did a sanguine lord become the queen of one of the grandest cities in the Brokken Empire? Tatarin shook himself free from the surprising revelation.
Now, what were we discussing before?
She asked, turning again to the herald.
Oh, that's right. You wanted to kill a god.